Hello, thank you. So I just want to start by saying, of course, it's an absolute privilege to be speaking to you all in person. I think the last time I had the honour was in 2019 at Umbraco UK Festival, so it's been quite a long time. But I want to start by saying that, and it goes without saying, I'm sure that, like so many of you, I love working with and using Umbraco. I believe its editor and its community are Umbraco's biggest strengths, and it's those two aspects that I want to focus on today. But while I love the editor experience, I believe we can make it even better. And to do that, we must come together as a community and look to empower our authors to make accessible content. Now, we're using the term authors quite regularly throughout today, so I just want to be very clear early on that while I, of course, do include content writers and anyone else editing and publishing content, I also include designers, developers, admin users, and anyone else accessing and using Umbraco. Again, I'm sure that means many of you here today. Now that I've cleared that up, I should probably also clear up who I am. So hello, I am Danny Lancaster. I'm an accessibility lead at Nexa Digital, who are a digital design agency with a focus on ensuring that no one is excluded from using digital services. We try and achieve this in numerous different ways, such as working with organisations on accessibility audits, training, and inclusive usability studies. Wider than that, though, we speak about accessibility regularly, such as today, and then we practice what we preach by embedding it in everything that we do. Please do feel free to reach out to me at the socials and my handle at D2 Lancaster. And I'm also very proud to call myself a Umbraco 3-time MVP for my work with the Umbraco accessibility team and its initiative, which is something I'll go in a bit more detail as I go through today. But unlike many of my Umbraco accessibility team members and many of my excellent fellow Umbraco MVPs, I myself am not a developer. So truth be told, I come from a background as a failed designer, as you'll probably see from some of my slides today. Spent several years working as a healthcare advisor and then went into the tech industry, starting as a graduate software tester. But regardless of my role, I've always seen the importance of accessibility throughout my life. And so it's because of that I would much rather introduce myself today through some very different experiences than these. So I think that's enough of my professional records, and instead, can we please have a look together at some of my hospital records instead? Because I'm not proud to say it, but I have done some very dumb stuff. So I was certainly one of those kids, my mum would be terrified every time I left the house, and my friends' parents would be equally terrified for having to look after me for any given amount of time, because I would inevitably go on to do something bizarre and often horrendous to myself in the process. So a couple of examples here, I won't go through them all, of course, but a couple I did want to share with you today. The first one being that's a terrible line for that, is the time when I was dented my cheekbone by trying to dodge a water balloon and ended up knocking myself out on a cement mixer handle. In there as well, I've had quite a few hand-related injuries as well, the main one being 2 days before my 21st birthday when I managed to rupture all the cartilages and destroy all the tendons in my fingers by dropping and trying to catch a glass in my university dorm room. So there's me at Hull Royal Infirmary, completely off my rocker and medication on my 21st birthday. It wasn't quite the state I expected to end up as, but there we go. And I just want to highlight as well the very subtle club-like device that's attached to me there. If you can imagine rocking that for 14 months of your university life, even at that age, kids can be quite cruel. To even more recently, when I snapped my clavicle in my shoulder when I was attempting a step over in football for the first time in 16 years or something like that. But all these experiences have impacted me in some way, and truth be told, I can expect many more in the future as well. But these experiences have also left me with some longer-term impacts as well. So, for example, because of the many hand-related injuries that have occurred to me, I found that I've got increased dexterity issues. So I found myself more prone to strain and things like that, or weak wrists. Likewise, though, since that incident on my 21st, I still can't straighten, nor do I have much feelings in the middle finger of my left hand since that incident. Now affectionately referred to as the claw by my very supportive wife. And in case you're doing it in your head, yes, that is complete with the voice from those little annoying aliens from Toy Story. But the fact is, my hands don't necessarily work the same as they used to. I also have visual impairments as well, so I've worn glasses for the last 20 years. And with cataract damage and many other types of impairments, they don't tend to get better over time, they tend to get worse, which is, again, something I've steadily been experiencing throughout my life. And I'm very reliant on my contacts and my glasses to get me through day to day. But it's so interesting how many people don't identify themselves to have an impairment when they need glasses. Most of them are even in denial about it and would apparently rather squint and sort of struggle rather than come to terms with it. But likewise, many of us don't see glasses as a form of assistive technology, even though, of course, it allows us to see where we previously struggled before. But the fact is, my eyes don't necessarily work the same as they used to either. And maybe you're lucky enough to go through life with no visual impairments, and you're hopefully nowhere near as clumsy as myself. But the one thing that we can't all avoid is getting older, right? So I'm not that spring chicken anymore. I'm not that kid with a bad posture and the pants that are just slightly too high anymore. And as with that incident, the football incident, maybe 5 years ago or something like that, I might have bounced straight back up from a fall like that. But instead it put me out for 6 weeks. So I know that the rest of my body, and my mind for that matter, doesn't necessarily work the same as it used to either. So when I say that accessibility will impact us all at some stage of our lives, you must know that I don't say this to scaremonger you. I say this to hopefully inspire you. Whether it be through temporary or situational impairments, changes through aging, or maybe it's someone you know, respect and love who lives with a disability every day. Maybe it's even yourself. The fact is, accessibility will impact us all at some stage of our lives. Now, I can't, and I won't ever, pretend or try to speak for the individuals or communities who live day to day with long-term and severe impairments. But I do believe it wasn't ever necessarily my condition that impaired me, but the society or environment. So for example, during my time at university, when I did a BA in digital arts, as you can imagine, as part of the course, we had to learn a range of softwares and technologies. And when that incident happened to me on my 21st, I found very different experiences to softwares and tools that I was relatively able to use fine when I had access to both hands. Like I said, I was a failed designer after all, so it wasn't the tools necessarily. But likewise, of course, it happened over quite a long period of time as well. 14 months is quite a substantial time. And the course didn't stop for me, and we had to continue to learn more and new softwares and technologies. And I found them equally challenging, maybe for different reasons, in that previously I had some familiarity with those other software, so I could use that to my advantage with things like workarounds, but I didn't have those to fall back to on those newer ones. And what's funny to me anyway is that when something wasn't accessible to me as a one-handed user, I didn't find myself cursing my condition or even the club. I cursed the software. And the fact is, none of the tools provided, nor the course itself, for that matter, was designed for anyone in mind other than a student who had access to two hands. So I found myself, in hindsight, being aligned to the social model for accessibility, in that it isn't necessarily our disabilities that impairs us, but our environments are simply not designed and built with everyone in mind. And unfortunately, that is never more true than in today's world. A lot of our services are still being designed and built for the average user, and excluding so many people in that process. For example, 15% of the population is registered to have a disability or impairment. That's an incredibly high number that we shouldn't be ignoring when it comes to trying to reach as many people as possible with our services, right? And while that is a high number, I would argue that number is likely to be even higher than that, because that's just the people registered on the system. So many people either can't get the diagnosis they need, or they simply don't consider themselves to be impaired. Of course, those people who do consider themselves to be impaired, and all their loved ones, of course, also have substantial spending power. So the purple pound, which refers to the spending power of disabled households, is estimated at £249 billion. And yet businesses are estimated to be losing £2 billion a month by excluding users and ignoring accessibility. Of course, e-commerce is one of the largest losses for this potential revenue. And currently, every 2 out of 3 transactions are being abandoned by people who are blind due to critical barriers. It means a serious gap in our market offerings if you weren't aware of accessibility, and frankly, bad business practice if you then choose to ignore it. On top of all that, though, it's simply the right thing to do. Access and inclusion are civil rights. And similarly, while a ramp will provide access to everyone compared to stairs, And you wouldn't dream of excluding someone from a physical store because of a disability. Our digital environments must also be built to accommodate everyone. So how does this translate then to our current digital services, and what's the landscape look like for accessibility in 2022? Well, spoiler, it's not great with you, to be honest. So accessibility has come a relatively long way with new guidelines, technologies, and legislation has played a part, but it's still got such a long way to go. One such example of this comes from WebAIM, who are a non-profit organisation and a leading expertise in the field of accessibility. They provide many cool tools and resources, but their most interesting project is the annual 1 million analysis. Now, this project identifies the top 1 million websites in the world based on many different demographics, such as location, language, industry, and it runs its own automated accessibility tool called Wave to get a snapshot of the digital landscape. And this tool that I mentioned is mapped to one of the largest frameworks for accessibility, which you may have heard of, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And from the most recent review in 2022, from the top 1 million homepages in the world, there are over 50 million distinct accessibility errors that were detected. Now, like I said, this isn't some random, search engine website crawl or anything like that. This is the top 1 million homepages in the world, and yet we're still looking at 50 errors per homepage on average. Pretty shocking, right? So let's just quickly look deeper then. What are the most common issues across that sample in 2022? Well, nearly 84% of those top 1 million homepages had low contrast text. 55% of them had missing alternative text to their images. 50% of them had empty links. 46% had missing form input labels. 27% had empty buttons. And 22% of the top 1 million homepages had a missing document language. Now, what's wild about these 6 issues here is they account for 96.5% of all those issues detected across that sample. And if that wasn't wild enough for you, then these have been the same for the last 4 years since WebAIM started this research. So please, if there's one takeaway from this talk, please run Wave on your services and ensure that as a starting point, you don't have those 6 issues. Because as stated in that report, addressing just those few types of issues would significantly improve accessibility across the web. However, there's always one, isn't there? Once we start looking into that tool and we start looking wider into accessibility, we're going to find a couple of things. We're first going to find different errors, alerts, and features to review within the automated tool and maybe other automated tools as well. We'll then go on to find out, though, that the best automated tools in the world will only account for roughly 40% of all the accessibility issues. So we'll know that there's processes and requirements that are going to be missing. And lastly, we would see the time and effort it would take to effectively run all of these tools and all of these tests across all of our services and pages would simply be too much. In other words, fixing accessibility issues in isolation per page once live is not going to be efficient nor effective in the grand scheme. Instead, we need to be looking to educate, embed, and have processes in place focused on accessibility. And Umbraco can play a key role in all of that. There is so much potential for what Umbraco could do when it comes to accessibility. For that landscape of accessibility to change, we need software that is responsible and help share responsibility to its users. In my experience, when producing and handing over accessibility audits to clients, their first action or response is to say they're going to hand it over to their internal developers to resolve. That is a massive extra responsibility on developers when they need to be keeping accessibility within the scope of what they can do. But likewise, I've seen and I've worked with many developers who will needlessly accept that responsibility and even start putting elaborate workarounds in their code for issues that could and should be resolved by other teams. Because accessibility is everyone's responsibility. Everyone has a part to play, including the software that we use. And the truth is, you can make a service as accessible as possible when it comes to designing and building it. But as soon as you open up through a content management system, you can, and unfortunately will in most cases, kiss all of that hard work goodbye. if the users aren't continuously trained in producing accessible content. And Umbraco can help us share that responsibility and then help us embed it within our processes. So imagine a world in which most of the work for accessibility, our clients, services, and users is handled at the content management level, leaving us then to explore new features and opportunities, right? So an example, as a starting point, let's have a look at those 6 issues from WebAIM's research and ask ourselves, if Umbraco empowered its authors to produce accessible content, which of these could be resolved through Umbraco? All of them. And that's the closest I'll get to a mic drop moment today. But yeah, the fact is that if Umbraco empowered its authors for accessibility, all of those and more could be checked, advised, and even resolved within Umbraco. By utilizing the CMS, we can ensure that responsibility for accessibility is shared, and there are no Umbraco instances with those 6 and many, many other accessibility issues in them. To do that, we have to empower our clients and our authors through Umbraco. It really could be the most accessible and therefore single, friendliest CMS in the world. So how do we get there then? We know that this work is, hopefully, if you weren't aware before, this work is important, it's affecting real users, and we know that Umbraco can help us. But how do we get there, and how do we bring the two together? Well, first, we need to get a better understanding about the major building blocks for accessibility and how they also work together. So I'm not here to teach anyone suck eggs by any means, but we typically have 2 streams to who's accessing our front end of our services, right? We've got our developers on the left, or authors as I like to refer to them, who use a combination of authoring tools such as Umbraco and evaluation tools such as Wave, for example, to create digital accessible content. Our users, on the other hand, will be using browsers, and I'm sure many of us will be using to access the web, but they may also be using assistive technologies to interact with those browsers. So an example may be one of the mainstream screen readers, in that a user is much more likely to install that at an operating system level rather than relying on a browser extension or one of those janky accessibility overlays. But that's a whole thing for another time. But it is really important for us to visualize, right? Because it allows us to see that actually when one component is weak, it actually causes very little motivation for the other components to implement it, as it doesn't necessarily result in a better or more accessible user experience. So we're very unlikely to implement an accessibility feature within Umbraco that isn't going to be supported by most of the major browsers. But likewise, and it's as I mentioned before, developers do tend to do more work to compensate for the lack of supported authoring tools. So they may put fix straight onto the front end or some logic onto the front end of the site rather than reusing it through the core, which is probably what they should do. And it's important that we don't have Umbraco to be that weak link, right? And to help us and guide us there are the many different relevant frameworks and guidelines that are in place that are built on top of the technical specifications of the web, such as HTML and CSS. So very quickly going through them, very quickly. We've got ATAG, which is the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, and as you can imagine, this does handle our authoring tools. We've also got the WCAG, which is the web content accessibility guidelines, and while this does, of course, handle our content, it's also used by developers, evaluation tools, and authoring tools as part of their processes as well. And lastly, we've got the UAAG, which is the user agent accessibility guidelines, and this looks at browsers and media players and some forms of assistive technologies. But of course, as part of Umbraco and what we want to try and achieve is, of course, going to be part of ATAG, because this directly relates to the authoring tool. But as I mentioned before, ATAG can't be met in isolation, and we actually have to use some of those principles from WCAG as well. Because if WCAG is designed for the front end of our services, then ATAG is designed for software and services that authors use to produce its content, such as a content management system. And it's broken up into 2 parts. So we've got part A, which is about making the back office accessible through very, very similar principles to the WCAG. It should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And this means we won't be excluding anyone who wishes to be a user of Umbraco, especially those with disabilities and impairments. So far, this work has largely been focused on by the Umbraco accessibility team and the many community members who have contributed to making accessibility fixes. In the last 3 years since we started this community team, we've seen regular progress with conducting regular audits, and near enough every release since we started of Umbraco has had some accessibility pull requests merged into it. And while we've been making steady progress in this area, it's always been Part B that's added quite a lot of complexity to us and to many other CMS vendors, as it directly relates to ensuring that the authoring tool helps its authors produce accessible content. And just to be very clear, I'm sure I don't need to be, but that term content, we're of course not just referring to the words, we're referring to how the pages are being structured, documents, widgets, and everything else. It's about ensuring that all of these can be checked and even resolved before they publish it to live. An initiative to address this lack of knowledge was the EU-commissioned We4Author cluster project. So by bringing many different vendors and partners together, the hope was to increase the level of accessibility within web authoring tools by default. So it was run by Funka, and we had Drupal, Joomla, SiteVision, TinyMC were part of it amongst others, and of course Umbraco, which was represented by myself and fellow community member Rachel Breeze. And the output of this work was a defined list of 10 features that the cluster felt all content management systems should implement by default. And these features include an accessible tables template, the ability to change the page at a paragraph or a page level, advise, inform, or even generate meaningful alternative text for images, create clear and consistent forms that can be used with assistive technologies, functionality to provide a title for video embeds, short contextual information within documentation, and then testing at different stages of the content cycle, including testing of documents. So providing mechanisms to create accessible content, and then others to educate and inform the users, the hope is that we'll be able to create more accessible services, and therefore more users will of course be able to access those digital services. Additionally, the cluster hopes this work will inspire all vendors to try and go to the next level for accessibility, and then look at other features and mechanisms they can implement within their cause. And I must just stress, that these features are not just nice to haves. So if they're implemented in the correct way, these features will make a significant difference to the landscape for accessibility and for our users. Many of those 6 common issues we mentioned from WebAIM's research can be directly resolved within these features. Additionally, we as an agency, and I'm sure many of you are seeing more requests during procurement relating to, of course, the accessibility of the agency, but also the CMS solution. Some of these are not even nice to haves if you're working with public sector services due to legislation. And on that legislation, when that legislation changes, and it almost certainly will, there's a real danger that Umbraco may not just be excluding users from accessing it, it might be excluding itself from many different markets and sectors. And lastly, it will make our jobs easier and more efficient by allowing us to share that responsibility for accessibility that's so desperately needed at the moment. Lastly, on this cluster and the work, I just wanted to say that it was incredibly inspiring and rewarding for myself, but also for Umbraco to be a part of that cluster. We're able to work collaboratively with many other vendors on a common cause, looking to shape the future of web authoring tools. It provided us a clear roadmap for Part B that we really needed. And it also allowed us to compare and look at our current capabilities at Umbraco compared to ATAG and against those other vendors. So through a mixture of self and commission assessments, each vendor was given a grade mapped against those 10 recommended features. And in terms of Umbraco's score then, that while we have a good rich text editor with tables functionality, a very strong form solution, of course, and the ability to test the website through packages, there's real opportunities and gaps across many of those features to either improve or to start implementing. But likewise, if we then compare our score against the averages of those other cluster vendors, we'll see there's actually a real opportunity for us to be absolutely the leading provider for CMS accessibility. As again, there's so many different gaps across those different features and those vendors as well. Now, I'm not naive. I know that some of these features are simply not easy, which is why they're not readily available by everyone. And while some will argue that most of the competitors are commercial and will have the benefit of dedicated resource and budget and things like that, like so many things, one of Umbraco's and open source's biggest strengths is its community. We can come together to find innovative and effective ways to overcome the barriers of those vendors by experience. So stand before you, Umbraco together, asking us to come together in making accessibility a first-class citizen and help Umbraco be the leading provider for CMS accessibility by empowering its authors. This has all, I'm not going to lie to you, been a long and hard-worked initiative, but we've never been stronger in our position to make accessibility improvements with Umbraco. In the last year, we received representation from Umbraco HQ and NEALS. We've continued the work in Part A, and we now have a clear roadmap for Part B based on recognized research with those features. But the fact is, the accessibility team has never and will never be able to do this work on our own. We need you involved in this incredibly important work. So please, if you haven't already, look to see how you can contribute. We have a dedicated GitHub space now, thanks to Seb, with dedicated accessibility issues. I'm very, very proud to say that on the last count, we've had over 200 pull requests merged into the core for accessibility since we started. And as proud of that number as I am, I would love us to see us double that this time next year, as there's still so many tickets on that board and more for us to find. Likewise in there, though, we have dedicated tickets to those cluster features, and the hope is that by increasing the visibility on them, we'll be able to have meaningful discussions and hopefully implementations. But the community is absolutely essential in continuing Umbraco through their accessibility journey. So please, in summary, if you haven't already taken your first steps into accessibility, please run Wave on your services. We also, in terms of accessibility, we don't need gatekeepers. We need this to be as open and to be as transparent as possible. So please, if you find issues within your services, if accessibility is new to you in your organization, please look to see who you can bring into your network and wider. And lastly, of course, the reason why I'm here, please see how you can get involved in the accessibility initiative. We simply can't do this without you. And lastly, I just wanted to leave you with a note on why I think, and a reminder that why I'm bringing this to you, the community, is because you are a very, very special community, and you all have the power to change the web with Umbraco. Thank you very much for your time. Please do reach out to me if you've got any questions.